In the spring of 1859, on a cotton plantation outside Natchez, Mississippi, a wealthy planter named Jonathan Ashford called his 23-year-old son, William, into his study and told him that he was a disgrace to the family bloodline, that his weakness was an embarrassment, and that no respectable white woman would ever marry him. Therefore, Jonathan had made a decision. William would be sent to live in the quarters with the enslaved people. Specifically, he would be given to Dinah, a 30-year-old enslaved woman who was considered the strongest, most physically capable worker on the plantation. William would remain there until Dinah became pregnant. If she bore a child, and that child survived and proved strong, then perhaps William's defective blood could be redeemed through mixing with superior physical stock. This was not a metaphor. This was not symbolic punishment. Jonathan Ashford literally gave his own son to an enslaved woman as part of a eugenic experiment rooted in the pseudo-scientific racism of 1859 America, combined with his contempt for his son's disability. What happened over the next 2 years would expose how racism, ableism, and patriarchal cruelty could converge in a single act of violence that destroyed multiple lives while revealing uncomfortable truths about how white supremacy viewed both disabled white people and enslaved black people as breeding stock to be manipulated. This is the story of William and Dinah, two people forced together by a man who saw them both as failures in need of correction, and how their forced cohabitation became something neither of them, and certainly not Jonathan Ashford, ever expected. Before we begin, I need to warn you. This story contains descriptions of forced breeding, ableism, racism, sexual coercion, eugenics ideology, and systemic violence. Both William and Dinah were victims of Jonathan Ashford's cruelty. This is documented history that reveals how multiple systems of oppression worked together. If you're ready, stay with me. William Ashford was born in 1836 to one of Mississippi's wealthiest planting families. His father, Jonathan, owned over 300 enslaved people across 2 plantations and was obsessed with theories of heredity, bloodlines, and what he called superior breeding. Jonathan read every scientific journal from Europe and the American North that discussed human variation, racial hierarchies, and genetic fitness. He believed absolutely in the pseudo-scientific racism of his era, that white people were superior, that black people were naturally suited for labor, and that careful breeding could enhance or diminish desirable traits. William was Jonathan's only son, his intended heir. And William was, in his father's eyes, a catastrophic failure of genetics. William had epilepsy. From childhood, he experienced seizures that varied in severity, sometimes brief absence seizures where he would simply stop and stare for a few seconds. Other times, full convulsive seizures that left him unconscious and disoriented for hours afterward. In 1850s America, epilepsy was deeply misunderstood. It was called the falling sickness, and theories about its cause ranged from demonic possession to moral weakness to hereditary degeneracy. There was no effective treatment. People with epilepsy were often institutionalized, hidden from society, or forbidden from marrying because they were considered unfit to reproduce. Jonathan Ashford was humiliated by his son's condition. He saw it as evidence that the Ashford bloodline had been corrupted, possibly by his wife's family genetics. When William was 15, Jonathan began restricting his social interactions, keeping him away from potential marriage prospects, telling people that William was studying abroad or in poor health. By the time William was 23, Jonathan had given up on the idea of William ever producing legitimate, white heirs through a respectable marriage. But Jonathan had another idea. 1. Rooted in the twisted eugenic logic of slavery and pseudoscience, if William's weakness came from bad breeding, perhaps it could be corrected by breeding with someone of superior physical constitution. And on his plantation, Jonathan owned someone he considered the physical ideal. Dinah was born into slavery around 1829 on the Ashford plantation. Plantation records describe her as exceptionally strong, tireless worker, excellent health, tall build. By the time she was 30 in 1859, Dinah had survived everything the plantation system threw at her: brutal labor, inadequate food, disease outbreaks that killed others, and the constant threat of sale or family separation. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, which was extraordinary for that era. She could pick more cotton, lift heavier loads, and work longer hours than almost anyone else on the plantation. Jonathan Ashford had already forced Dinah to have 4 children with different enslaved men he had deliberately selected for their physical traits. All 4 children had been sold away by the time they were 7 years old, maximizing profit from their sale as young, healthy slaves. Dinah had no say in who she was forced to reproduce with. Her body was, in Jonathan's view, a breeding resource to be managed like livestock. In March of 1859, Jonathan implemented his plan. He called William to his study and told him, "You are unfit to marry into respectable white society. But you will not disgrace this family by dying childless. You will go to the quarters and live with Dinah. You will produce a child with her. If that child is strong and healthy, it will prove that your weakness can be overcome by superior physical stock. If the child is weak like you, then we will know your blood is hopelessly corrupted. Either way, you will remain there until this is done." William protested. He had no desire to rape an enslaved woman. He had no desire to participate in his father's grotesque experiment. But Jonathan made it clear if William refused, he would be institutionalized in an asylum for epileptics, a fate that in 1859 was essentially a death sentence. William would lose all inheritance, all social standing, all freedom. Jonathan had already drawn up the commitment papers. Dinah was given no choice at all. She was property. Jonathan simply told her that William would be living in her cabin and that she was expected to become pregnant with his child. If she refused or failed to conceive, she would be sold to the brutal labor camps in the deep South sugar plantations, where the average life expectancy was less than 7 years. In April of 1859, William Ashford was moved to the slave quarters. He was given a small space in Dinah's cabin, a one-room structure she had lived in alone since her last child had been sold 3 years earlier. He brought nothing with him except the clothes he wore and the medicine he took to try to control his seizures, medicine that rarely worked. The first weeks were torture for both of them. William was accustomed to plantation luxury, fine food, soft beds, servants attending to his needs. Now he slept on a cornshuck mattress, ate the same rations as enslaved people, which were deliberately insufficient, and was subjected to the same surveillance and control. Other enslaved people on the plantation watched him with a mixture of satisfaction at seeing a white man brought low and deep discomfort at the dynamics of his presence. Dinah had lived through forced breeding before, but never like this. The men Jonathan had previously forced her with were enslaved men who had no choice either. They were victims too. But William was white, the master's son, and even though he was being punished and controlled, he still carried the inherent power of whiteness and maleness that made Dinah's position even more precarious. According to testimony that emerged years later from other enslaved people who lived in the quarters, William did not initially force himself on Dinah. For the first month, they barely spoke. William suffered 3 major seizures in those first weeks, during which Dinah, despite having every reason to let him hurt himself, made sure he didn't fall into the fire or choke. When other enslaved people asked her why she bothered, she reportedly said, "He did not choose this any more than I did. We are both his father's prisoners." Jonathan checked on them weekly, demanding to know if Dinah was pregnant yet. Each time the answer was no, he became more threatening. By the end of the 2nd month, he told them both explicitly that if conception did not happen soon, he would have William institutionalized and Dinah sold south. This is where the story becomes impossibly complicated. What happened between William and Dinah over the following months exists in a moral gray area that makes modern viewers deeply uncomfortable. Did they eventually have a sexual relationship? Yes. Was it consensual? How can anything be truly consensual when one person is enslaved, the other is the enslaver's son, even if disgraced, and both are being coerced under threat of death or worse? Letters that William wrote years later, letters discovered in the 1970s in an archive in Ohio, describe what he called an arrangement born of mutual survival rather than desire. He wrote that Dinah made it clear she would cooperate to the extent necessary to avoid being sold, but that she would never pretend affection or submission. He wrote that he felt both disgust at his father and disgust at himself for participating, but that he saw no escape for either of them except compliance. What we know from testimony is that by August of 1859, 5 months after William had been moved to the quarters, Dinah was pregnant. Jonathan Ashford was triumphant. His eugenic experiment was progressing exactly as planned. He told William that he would be allowed to return to the main house once the child was born and proved healthy, and that the child would be raised as a valuable slave who would eventually be sold for a premium price, as light-skinned, mixed-race slaves were highly valued in the fancy trade. But something else was happening that Jonathan Ashford did not anticipate. William and Dinah, forced together under the worst possible circumstances, had begun talking. William taught Dinah to read and write, which was illegal under Mississippi law and punishable by death for both of them if discovered. Dinah taught William how to survive on inadequate food, how to move through the world that enslaved people navigated daily, how to recognize the humanity in people his father treated as animals. When William had seizures, which happened frequently under the stress and poor nutrition, Dinah cared for him with skill born from decades of taking care of sick people in the quarters with no medical support. She knew which herbs helped, how to position his body, how to keep him from injuring himself. For the first time in his life, William experienced disability care that wasn't rooted in shame or rejection but in practical competence. They formed something that was not love, not friendship in any conventional sense, but a bond forged by shared oppression. As William wrote in his letters, "We were both reduced to our bodies. Mine because it failed my father's standards of fitness, hers because slavery had never seen her as anything more than a body. And in that reduction, we found a strange equality. We were both specimens in his experiment, and we both wanted it to fail." In February of 1860, Dinah gave birth to a daughter. The child was healthy, lighter skinned than Dinah but clearly of mixed race, with features that suggested both parents. Jonathan Ashford examined the baby with the clinical detachment of a livestock breeder and declared the experiment a success. The child would be raised in the quarters, monitored for health and strength, and eventually sold when she reached peak value at around age 14. Jonathan told William he could return to the main house. The experiment was complete. William would remain unmarried and produce no legitimate heirs, but at least he had proven he could reproduce viable offspring under the right conditions. Jonathan wrote to colleagues about his success, framing it as evidence that even degenerate stock could produce valuable results when properly managed. William refused to leave. He told his father he would stay in the quarters with Dinah and the child. Jonathan was furious, seeing this as William's final betrayal, not just failing to be the perfect white heir, but choosing to live among enslaved people. Jonathan threatened to sell Dinah and the baby. William threatened to tell every newspaper in Mississippi about the forced breeding experiment, about Jonathan's treatment of his own son, about the eugenic theories that Jonathan had documented in letters that would destroy his reputation. They were at an impasse. And then the entire system collapsed. In November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded in December. Mississippi followed in January 1861. By April, the Civil War had begun. The Ashford plantation, like all plantations, descended into chaos. Labor systems broke down. Enslaved people began running away. Jonathan Ashford joined the Confederate Army and left for war, leaving the plantation under the control of an overseer. William used the chaos to implement his plan. In June of 1861, he took Dinah, their daughter, who they had named Sarah, though she had no legal name, and 15 other enslaved people from the plantation, and they escaped north. It was an almost impossible journey. A disabled white man, a black woman with an infant, and a group of freedom seekers traveling through Confederate territory during wartime. But they had help from underground railroad networks, from Quaker communities, from free black people who risked everything to help runaways. They made it to Ohio by September of 1861. William had money he had hidden from his father. He used it to purchase a small farm. He filed paperwork claiming that Dinah was his wife, which was illegal in Mississippi, but not in Ohio after 1860, and that Sarah was his legitimate daughter. He lived there with Dinah and Sarah until his death in 1868 from complications following a severe seizure. He was 32 years old. Dinah lived until 1891. After William's death, she ran the farm herself, raised Sarah, and eventually remarried a free black man named Thomas Freeman. When interviewed by a local historian in 1889, Dinah was asked if William had been her husband. She responded, "He was the father of my child. He freed me when he could have sold me. He taught me to read. He left me property. Whether he was my husband depends on what you mean by that word. He was a good man trapped in an evil system, and we did what we had to do to survive it." Sarah, the child born of this forced eugenic experiment, lived until 1934. She grew up free in Ohio, married a black farmer, had 6 children, and became a school teacher. She knew the full story of her parents. William had written it all down in the letters he left for her. When asked about her father in an interview conducted in 1932, she said, "My father was epileptic. My mother was enslaved." His father thought they were both breeding stock to be experimented on. Instead, they became people who cared for each other in impossible circumstances. "I exist because of evil, but I exist free because they chose each other over the system that tried to destroy them both." The story of William, Dinah, and Sarah was nearly lost. Jonathan Ashford's papers, including documentation of his eugenic experiment, were destroyed during the Civil War. But William's letters survived, donated to the Ohio Historical Society by Sarah's grandchildren in 1971. A historian named Dr. Marcus Webb discovered them in 1976 and published a book in 1981 titled Unfit, Eugenics, Disability, and Forced Breeding in the Antebellum South. This story reveals how multiple systems of oppression, racism, ableism, patriarchy, the pseudoscience of eugenics, could converge in a single act of cruelty. Jonathan Ashford saw his disabled son as genetically defective. He saw his enslaved woman as breeding stock. He combined these two forms of dehumanization in an experiment that treated both of them as objects to be manipulated in pursuit of his twisted vision of controlled heredity. But William and Dinah refused to be only what Jonathan wanted them to be. They taught each other, they protected each other, they escaped together. And they raised a daughter who lived free, educated, and surrounded by family, everything Jonathan's system was designed to prevent. This is why we tell these stories. Because oppression is never simple. Because people categorized as unfit by eugenics, whether because of disability or race, fought back by insisting on their own humanity. Because survival under impossible circumstances sometimes requires alliances that don't fit neat narratives. Because a disabled white man and an enslaved black woman could recognize each other's humanity when the system told them both they were defective. If this story challenges you, good. Subscribe to Buried Truths for more stories that expose how systems of oppression intersect. Comment below, how do we understand relationships formed under coercion? Where is the line between victimhood and agency when everyone involved is being controlled? What does William and Dinah's story teach us about solidarity across different forms of oppression? Share this with someone who needs to understand that disability oppression and racial oppression aren't separate. They're tools of the same system of control. The truth is buried. We're bringing it back.